What kind of man recaptures the holiest city in the world and then shows mercy to every single person inside it? What kind of leader is so honorable, so disciplined, so extraordinary that his greatest enemies write about him with open admiration? In this video, I'm going to tell you the full story of Saladin, the Kurdish general who rose from nothing to become the most powerful ruler in the medieval Islamic world. And by the end, you'll understand why his enemies respected him almost as much as his own people did. To understand Saladin, you first have to understand the world he inherited. In 1099, 88 years before Saladin retook Jerusalem, the First Crusade had arrived in the Holy Land with fire and iron. When the Crusader army breached the walls of Jerusalem on the 15th of July, 1099, what followed was one of the most brutal massacres in medieval history. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe streets running with blood. Thousands of civilians killed without mercy. The city's Jewish population burned alive in their synagogue. Bodies piled so high that survivors could not move through the streets. The Muslim world was traumatized, and for nearly a century it remained divided, fractured between competing dynasties, rival caliphates, and regional powers too busy fighting each other to challenge the Crusader states that had embedded themselves along the Mediterranean coast. Into this fractured, wounded world, Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born, around 1137 AD, in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq, a Kurdish nobleman's son. Nobody at the time would have predicted what he would become. The rise, from student to sultan. Saladin's early life was not that of a warrior. He was bookish, scholarly, deeply interested in Islamic theology and law. His early education was in Damascus, where he studied under some of the great religious scholars of the age. It was his uncle, Shirkuh, a brilliant general in the service of Nur ad-Din, who first pulled the young Saladin into the world of military and political power. In 1163, Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh to Egypt on a military mission, with Saladin reluctantly accompanying him. Egypt was the prize that everyone wanted. Wealthy, fertile, strategically vital, and politically unstable under the weakening Fatimid Caliphate. The Crusader states wanted it, Nur ad-Din wanted it, and a succession of internal Egyptian factions were fighting each other for control. Saladin watched, learned, and waited. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, Saladin, still only in his early 30s, was appointed in his place as vizier of Egypt. Within 2 years, he had consolidated complete control. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, simply ceased to exist. Saladin replaced it with his own Ayyubid dynasty, loyal to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. He had taken Egypt without a single major battle. Pure political genius. But Egypt alone was not enough. Saladin understood with absolute clarity that to challenge the Crusader states, to even think about recapturing Jerusalem, the Muslim world needed to be unified. That meant Syria, it meant Mesopotamia, it meant bringing the rival Muslim powers under a single banner. Through a combination of military pressure, political marriage, diplomacy, and the powerful ideological currency of jihad, holy war against the Crusader occupation, Saladin spent the next 15 years building the most powerful Muslim coalition the region had seen since the early Islamic conquests. He was not always gentle about it. Several Muslim rulers who resisted his unification found themselves facing his army. But Saladin was always careful to present himself not as a conqueror of fellow Muslims, but as a unifier, a servant of the wider Islamic cause, rather than his own ambition. Whether this was genuine piety or brilliant political calculation, or, most likely, both, it worked. By 1186, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and Yemen. He had built his instrument. Now he was ready to use it. The Battle of Hattin, the masterstroke. The 4th of July, 1187. The Horns of Hattin, a volcanic ridge above the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. This is where Saladin destroyed the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in a single afternoon. The Crusader army, the largest force the kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled, led by the deeply unpopular King Guy of Lusignan, had been lured away from their water supplies in a forced march across waterless terrain in the blazing July heat. Saladin understood something that Guy had not. An army without water, in the July heat of the Jordan Valley, is not an army. It is a dying organism. Saladin's forces harassed the Crusaders throughout their march, setting fire to the dry grass around them, filling the air with smoke, cutting off every attempt to reach water. By the morning of the 4th of July, the Crusader army was exhausted, dehydrated, and barely able to fight. Saladin's fresh, well-watered forces closed around them on the slopes of the Horns of Hattin. The Crusader infantry collapsed first, then the cavalry attempted a series of desperate charges that Saladin's forces absorbed and repelled with almost contemptuous ease. By midday, it was over. The true cross, the holiest relic of the Crusader kingdom, carried into every major battle as a symbol of divine protection, was captured. King Guy himself was taken prisoner. The military power of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had been effectively destroyed in a single engagement. The road to Jerusalem was open. Jerusalem, the moment of mercy. 3 months after Hattin, on the 2nd of October, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. And here is the moment that defines him above all others. Every person in Jerusalem, Christian civilians, knights, clergy, pilgrims, expected what had happened in 1099. They expected massacre. Saladin ordered none. Every Christian who could pay a ransom was allowed to leave freely. Saladin personally paid the ransoms of many who could not afford them. His own brother, Saladin, paid the ransoms of 1,000 more. The Christian civilians who remained in the city were not harmed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site of Christendom, was left intact and open to Christian pilgrims. When the Patriarch of Jerusalem left the city, he took with him not just his personal possessions, but the treasures of the church: gold, silver, precious objects accumulated over a century of Crusader rule. Saladin's advisors urged him to seize them. Saladin refused. He had given his word. That was enough. The contrast with 1099 was so stark that even contemporary Christian chroniclers, men who were by definition his enemies, could not bring themselves to describe it as anything other than extraordinary. Richard the Lionheart, the worthy enemy. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe into action. The Third Crusade, led by the 3 most powerful rulers in the Western world, including Richard I of England, known to history as the Lionheart, arrived in the Holy Land in 1191. Richard was extraordinary, a genuine military genius, perhaps the finest battlefield commander in Europe at the moment. And what followed was one of the most fascinating military rivalries in medieval history. Saladin and Richard never actually met face to face, but they corresponded, they sent each other gifts, they negotiated with a mutual respect that transcended the war they were fighting. When Richard fell ill with fever during the campaign, Saladin sent fresh fruit and ice packed from the mountain snows to the Crusader camp. When Richard's horse was killed beneath him during the Battle of Jaffa, Saladin sent him 2 replacement horses. His enemies sent him horses. Richard fought Saladin to a standstill. He won victories at Arsuf and Jaffa. He marched his army to within sight of Jerusalem twice, but he never took the city. Partly because of military reality, partly because Richard understood, as a brilliant strategist, that he couldn't hold Jerusalem even if he took it. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed the Treaty of Jaffa. Christians would have free access to Jerusalem as pilgrims. Jerusalem itself remained in Muslim hands. Richard left the Holy Land. He never returned. Saladin won. The death of Saladin. What was left behind? On 4th of March, 1193, less than a year after the Treaty of Jaffa, Saladin died in Damascus. He was 55 years old. And here is the detail that says everything about the man. The Sultan who controlled Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Yemen, who had defeated the mightiest Crusader army ever assembled, who had outmaneuvered Richard the Lionheart, who had recaptured Jerusalem, died with almost nothing. When his treasurer counted his personal wealth after his death, there was not enough money to pay for his funeral. Everything had been given away, to his soldiers, to the poor, to the mosques and schools and hospitals he had funded across his empire. He had spent his life accumulating power, and spent that power entirely in service of something larger than himself. His people were devastated by his loss. Even his enemies mourned him. Saladin was not a perfect man. He was a political operator of the highest order. He could be ruthless when the situation demanded it. He spent decades at war, and war is never clean. But in an age defined by brutality, by massacre and pillage, and the deliberate targeting of civilians as instruments of terror, Saladin chose a different path. Not because he was weak, because he understood that how you win matters as much as whether you win. The Crusaders came to the Holy Land with the certainty that God was on their side. Saladin answered with strategy, discipline, and a code of honor so consistent and so genuine that it survived 14 centuries and still speaks clearly today. Jerusalem, the mercy, the horses sent to a sick enemy, the empty treasury at his death. These are not the details of a legend. They are the details of a life, and they deserve to be remembered.